The ancient Egyptians harbored a deep-rooted sense of cultural superiority. They viewed themselves as a distinct and exceptional civilization, believing that their land was uniquely favored and shielded by natural barriers such as deserts and seas, which separated them from less fortunate neighbors. However, this image they projected was far from accurate. Located at the intersection of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, Egypt was, in reality, a crossroads of people and cultures. From the earliest times, the fertile lands along the Nile and in the delta attracted migrants from surrounding arid and inhospitable regions to the west, east, and south. Each new wave of settlers brought with them skills, technologies, and traditions that would help reshape and revitalize Egyptian society. Occasionally, however, these newcomers arrived with motives beyond peaceful integration. Some carried aspirations of conquest along with their cultural contributions. While invasions were infrequent, Egypt was not invulnerable. When governed by a strong and centralized authority, such threats were often thwarted. But during times of political instability, particularly in the vulnerable northeast, the country became exposed to foreign ambitions. The decline of the Middle Kingdom's strength toward the end of one of its most prosperous periods opened the door to external threats. Egypt's determined focus on internal control and the defense of its frontiers had led its rulers to implement substantial measures to protect the northeastern delta. Unlike the fortified region of Semna in Nubia, where complete closure was achievable, Egypt's northeastern terrain made a total seal impossible. Nevertheless, a formidable defensive barrier known as the Walls of the Ruler, first established by Amenemhat I and reinforced by his heirs, was erected to discourage enemy advances. These fortifications were accompanied by regular patrols intended to observe, intercept, and regulate border crossings. At the center of these defenses stood Jaru, modern-day Tel el-Hebwa, a critical military stronghold that rivaled any fortress found in southern territories. Even with this fortified border, migration from the Near East continued. In fact, rather than being curtailed, the movement of people into the delta increased over time. Some of these newcomers were likely prisoners taken during Egyptian military campaigns. Others arrived legally, recruited by the state to contribute to mining expeditions in the Sinai, participate in large-scale building projects in the Fayum, or serve as scouts, trackers, and guards along Egypt's desert frontiers. By the close of this era, foreigners had become a noticeable presence in the population. Immigrants from the Near East not only integrated but also began to climb the social ladder, with some even attaining administrative roles. In the northeastern delta, where many had first settled, small clusters of foreign workers grew into sizable communities. These areas became magnets for further immigration, as people fleeing worsening conditions in their homelands sought refuge and opportunity among their already established kin in Egypt. One particular location became the focal point of this ongoing wave of newcomers. The town of Haweret, located on the eastern bank of the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, was originally founded as a modest border outpost by the Heracleopolitan dynasty. It was later re-established by Amenemhat I as part of his efforts to fortify Egypt's frontier. However, during the weakened reigns of his successors, Amenemhat IV and Sobenferu, the border monitoring system appears to have faltered, allowing a continuous flow of migrants to enter the country. After settling in Haweret, these immigrants built homes in their own architectural style and preserved their cultural practices. But they were far from unfamiliar with Egyptian life. In fact, many were already well versed in Egyptian customs before arriving, indicating likely origins in places such as the Lebanese port of Kebni, which had long-standing political and cultural ties to Egypt. Some may have come from as far as Cyprus. Among them were Bedouin tribes from southern Palestine, drawn into the migration surge flooding into the Nile Delta. This convergence of different peoples, languages, and customs quickly transformed Haweret into a uniquely diverse town, unlike any other in the region. Given that individuals of Asiatic descent had already held important positions elsewhere in Egypt, it's not surprising that the chances for social advancement in Haweret were even greater. One notable official expressed his status in traditional Egyptian style by commissioning a large stone statue for his tomb chapel. However, he also made a point to highlight his foreign heritage. His portrait featured a large, red, mushroom-shaped hairstyle characteristic of immigrants from Kebni, and his skin was painted yellow, in line with the Egyptian artistic convention for portraying Asiatics. The curved throw stick he held served both as a symbol of his rank and a cultural marker, as it was also the hieroglyph for Asiatic. This individual clearly took pride in his heritage and displayed it openly in the face of Egyptian attitudes toward foreigners. Within just a generation, the Asiatic community in Hutweret had become secure in its distinct cultural identity, wealthy from Mediterranean trade, and increasingly assertive in local politics. A grand residence was constructed to serve as the governor's official quarters. It was, in essence, a palace with royal ambitions. Around it, senior officials were buried in elaborately decorated tombs, each one following Asiatic funerary traditions, such as the symbolic burial of 2 donkeys at the tomb's entrance. One such tomb belonged to a man who identified himself as the overseer of retinue, a title typically reserved for Egyptian officials managing relations with the region of Syria-Palestine. Another belonged to a chief steward and treasurer. Although these titles suggest the central administration still had a presence, it remains uncertain whether the leadership in Hutweret still regarded the king in Ijtai as their true authority. At the very least, the royal court appeared to be preoccupied with more pressing concerns elsewhere. After 200 years of rule by a single dynasty, the government found itself unprepared for the succession crisis that followed Sobekneferu's short reign. It seemed as though the ruling elite had forgotten how their ancestors had dealt with the end of a royal line. What followed was a rapid and chaotic rotation of kings, echoing the disorder that marked the close of the Old Kingdom. Rulers came and went with startling speed, some occupying the throne for only a few months as one contender after another laid claim to the crown. Over the span of about 150 years, Egypt saw roughly 50 different rulers in stark contrast to the mere 8 kings of the preceding 2 centuries. It appears that Egypt's most influential families, unable to agree on a single heir, adopted a system of rotating succession. Since senior members of each competing family likely held the most prestige, Egypt effectively became a nation ruled by the elderly, with aged kings ascending one after the other, each attempting to leave a legacy. Despite this distortion of traditional kingship, the central government continued to function with surprising efficiency. The real work of governance fell to high officials like viziers and treasurers, while kings, once central to all state affairs, became more ceremonial. Government records of the time still paid formal respect to royal authority, even though it was the officials who now decided who would become king, not the other way around. However, the broader population could not ignore the cracks forming in the monarchy. Common citizens stopped referring to the king or royal palace on their funerary monuments, likely realizing that invoking such unstable figures held little sway over their chances in the afterlife. Many kings didn't rule long enough to even secure their own burial arrangements. Pyramid construction came to a near halt, with several monarchs resorting to being buried in simple shaft tombs located within older pyramid complexes built by 12th dynasty rulers. Expeditions to the mineral-rich Sinai Peninsula ceased entirely. The once glorious image of royal power faded, replaced by a monarchy struggling to project any sense of authority or permanence. The rise of Sokhotep III around 1680 BC highlighted just how much had changed in barely 50 years. Unlike many of his predecessors, Sokhotep made no attempt to conceal his humble origins. In fact, he celebrated them. Through inscriptions, he proudly acknowledged his common-born parents and openly recognized his non-royal family members, signaling a broader breakdown in the concept of divine kingship. His background in the military, including time served in the royal bodyguard, gave him insight into the inner workings of the court, which he used to his advantage. As king, he expanded the government by appointing more officials and revived construction efforts in an attempt to bring back some semblance of order. Still, these efforts were temporary fixes. The core of royal authority continued to weaken. Even the occasional resurgence of activity could not hide the fact that the monarchy's power was fading fast. The crisis was especially severe in Egypt's distant territories, particularly at the forts of occupied Wawat. A weakened administration no longer had the capacity to maintain the rotating military garrisons that had once protected these outposts during the height of the 12th dynasty. One after another, the Egyptian government surrendered these Nubian strongholds, having lost the ability to enforce its authority beyond the traditional boundaries of the two lands. The last to be relinquished were the forts in the Semna Gorge, where the 13th dynasty made a final, half-hearted attempt to uphold the frontier established by Senusret III. Eventually, even Semna itself was handed over to the local population as the last government representatives withdrew for good. With no more hope of regular supplies or support from the capital, some of the fortress communities began to consider an unthinkable option. Despite its past as Egypt's enemy, the kingdom of Kush offered something the Egyptian state no longer could: gold, and the ability to pay those willing to serve. A similar collapse unfolded in the northeastern delta. Patrols ceased, garrisons were called back, and Egypt's most exposed frontier was effectively abandoned. It wasn't long before a new figure stepped into the vacuum. A man named Nehazi assumed control of the forts and quickly proclaimed himself king of an independent delta realm, establishing his capital at Hutweret and directly challenging the legitimacy of the central government at Ijtai. Once in power, Nehazi followed the traditional patterns of Egyptian kingship. He preserved the existing administrative structure and aligned himself with his local patron god, Seth, the deity of Hutweret. A temple built in his honor at this time may have served to demonstrate his religious devotion. With oak trees lining its courtyard and its walls painted a striking blue, the Asiatic temple was among the largest of its kind in the Near East and symbolized the wealth and self-assurance of Nehazi's short-lived kingdom. However, despite its promising start, Nehazi's rule faced internal strife. Acts of deliberate destruction, such as the defacement of earlier burial statues, point to social unrest. The town also took on a militarized character, with soldiers interred alongside their weapons and the streets resonating with the clamor of metalworkers forging arms. In earlier periods, a rebellious province would have been swiftly and brutally brought back under control. But the government at Ijtai was in no condition to reclaim Hutweret through military force. Nehazi's secession was a devastating blow to the 13th dynasty. It severed what little remained of Egypt's ties to the Near East and deprived the state of crucial trade revenue. The dynasty stumbled on, maintaining only the outward symbols of authority, but it was clear its power was hollow. It wasn't long before both the central government and the breakaway Delta Kingdom met their downfall, overwhelmed by a combination of natural calamities and human conflict. At Hutweret, famine and disease struck hard. Entire families were buried hastily, without the usual ceremonial care. The final years of the 13th dynasty in the south also saw an unusually rapid succession of rulers, suggesting that the plague had reached them too. As sickness swept across Lower Egypt, the region became vulnerable to foreign invasion. From beyond the eastern border, a formidable army armed with advanced weaponry invaded the weakened land. They quickly seized Hutweret and continued southward, eventually capturing the historic capital of Memphis. Thus began the rise of the Hyksos. The Hyksos represented an unprecedented episode in ancient Egyptian history. For over 100 years, a Semitic-speaking elite from the coastal region of Lebanon held dominion over northern Egypt, and were acknowledged as rulers throughout much of the country. They reshaped their capital at Hutweret into a city deeply rooted in Asiatic culture, worshipped the foreign deity Baal, and observed burial practices unfamiliar to Egyptian tradition. Even their names marked them as outsiders. To future generations, their ascendancy symbolized the unraveling of the established order. Yet during their rule, the northeastern delta flourished. Economic activity surged thanks to thriving trade with the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Hutweret swelled to 2 or 3 times its previous size and emerged as the command center of a small empire that stretched into southern Palestine and along the Lebanese coastline. The fall of Memphis to the Hyksos was a devastating blow to the 13th dynasty, both symbolically and strategically. Memphis stood as a powerful emblem of national unity, positioned at the vital crossroads between the Nile Valley and the Delta. Losing it forced the royal court to abandon Ijtai and retreat hurriedly to the south. So sudden was their flight that they left behind valuable temple and state archives, meaning future dynasties had to reconstruct religious texts from scratch, cut off from the accumulated wisdom of past generations. The displaced court re-established a makeshift government in Thebes, the traditional bastion of Egyptian autonomy. However, their authority had diminished drastically, now confined to the southernmost 7 nomes. In the interim, as the exiled leadership adjusted to their reduced domain, much of the central Nile Valley found itself without clear leadership. At Abydos, the sacred city of Osiris, the absence of divine kingship was especially troubling. In response, local elites took the initiative and proclaimed a new ruling line. But lacking experienced craftsmen and trained administrators, these so-called kings of Abydos projected a diminished version of royalty. Their roughly made monuments stood in stark contrast to their lofty ambitions. It was a brave but ultimately unsuccessful effort to maintain Egypt's most sacred institution at one of its most revered religious sites. Within 2 decades, the fledgling dynasty at Abydos had vanished, leaving behind almost no trace. Farther south in Thebes, the refugees from Ijtai found relatively better fortune. To many in Upper Egypt, they remained the rightful rulers of the 2 lands. Loyal families who had once served the old regime continued to support the exiled court. But this impression of continuity was deceptive. The political landscape had shifted dramatically. Once a thriving city, blessed with royal attention and enriched through trade across Egypt and Nubia, Thebes was now cut off. The city was left diminished. Even the gods seemed to have turned away. Natural calamities deepened the nation's suffering. Less than 10 years after the evacuation of Ijtai, a severe flood struck Thebes, inundating the temple of Ammonius at Ipitsut, the spiritual heart of the region. In a gesture of leadership, the king chose to confront the crisis directly, wading into the submerged hall of the sanctuary to assess the damage, while his weary followers trailed behind him in silence. The next Egyptian ruler found himself confronting a devastating trio of crises: famine, flooding, and foreign invasion. Neferhotep III claimed credit for sustaining Thebes through the worst of the food shortages and for defending his city when it was submerged. Yet, when Hyksos forces pushed southward, all he could do was attempt to bolster public morale, urging the people to face the enemy with courage. Highlighting his role as a military leader was a strategic move to inspire resistance, but titles like Guide of Mighty Thebes seemed more like wishful thinking than a reflection of real power. Across the land, from the throne to the common people, there was a growing dread that Thebes would suffer the same fate as Memphis. The most revealing record from this period is a stela erected at the temple of Ipitsut by King Mentuhotep, a name that evoked traditional Theban authority, though its script betrayed a provincial flair. The inscription follows the customary Egyptian tone of exaggeration, with Mentuhotep likening his troops to crocodiles on the flood. Yet his personal claims to power were telling. Referring to himself as king within Thebes, this my city, he appeared to acknowledge his limited influence. His self-description as one who acts as king was a far cry from the confident declarations of earlier monarchs. Nothing illustrated the collapse of Egyptian authority more clearly than the fate of the southern frontier. As the 13th dynasty declined, the government abandoned the Nubian fortresses, leaving their garrisons behind. In the absence of support, many of these Egyptians sought new livelihoods. The Kingdom of Kush, Egypt's longtime rival and a wealthy trading power in its own right, swiftly moved in. It absorbed the region of Wawat and seized control of the forts with barely any opposition. During the Hyksos occupation of northern Egypt, Egyptians living in Wawat adapted to the new regime, willingly serving their Nubian overlords. At Buhan, a man named Ka proudly declared himself a brave servant of the ruler of Kush. The local commander, Sopter, even took part in restoring the temple of Horus at Buhan, stating it was done to the satisfaction of the ruler of Kush. In dedicating his commemorative inscription, Sopter left no stone unturned. He invoked traditional Egyptian deities like Tasokar Osiris and Horus, the local god of Buhan, as well as the deified Senusret III. Yet he also included the unnamed gods that are in Wawat. It was a cautious gesture, clearly meant to please multiple audiences. One can only imagine Senusret III, once the great defender of Egypt's southern border, turning in his grave. Now the roles had reversed. Egyptians, not Nubians, were the ones paying taxes on traded goods. They, not their southern neighbors, were being dictated to. The glorious days of the 12th dynasty must have felt like a distant, fading legend. In stark contrast, the Hyksos kingdom was thriving. As more Asiatic immigrants settled in the eastern delta, existing communities expanded rapidly, giving rise to new settlements and associated cemeteries throughout the region. A significant fortified town was established at Tel El Yahudiyah, complementing the Hyksos' other defensive positions across the frontier zone. Confident in their control of the land, the Hyksos rulers fully embraced and showcased their unique cultural heritage. At Hut-Weret, altars burned continuously with offerings before the principal temple, dedicated to Baal-Zephon, whose cult had quickly merged with that of Seth, the Egyptian storm deity. Young children who passed away were buried according to Asiatic tradition in imported Palestinian amphorae, despite Egyptian versions being sturdier and more protective. In their economic practices, the Hyksos deliberately turned away from Egypt's traditional trade routes. They avoided commercial exchanges with Middle and Upper Egypt, choosing instead to trade extensively with Palestine and Cyprus. Goods like wine, olive oil, timber, and copper poured into the busy harbor at Hut-Weret, enriching the city and transforming it into one of the most prominent royal capitals in the Near East. To demonstrate their power and prosperity, the Hyksos constructed a grand citadel along the Nile. Built on reclaimed land, it spanned over 500,000 square feet and was protected by a massive curtain wall 25 feet thick, reinforced with buttresses. Inside, the royal palace was lavish and luxurious. Gardens and vineyards supplied fresh produce and provided shelter from the intense Egyptian heat, while a specially built, stone-lined channel brought clean water directly from the Nile into the palace grounds. Amid this wealth and security, the character of Hyksos rule began to shift. Earlier rulers had been satisfied with the title rulers of foreign lands, a label previously used during the Middle Kingdom to describe princes from the Near East. But with the rise of King Kian around 1610 BC, a new ambition emerged. At the height of Hyksos' dominance, Kian sought recognition as a legitimate Egyptian pharaoh equal to his economic stature. He sent a diplomatic gift to the Minoan king of Knossos on Crete, signaling his entry onto the international stage. At home, Kian adopted a complete pharaonic titulary, beginning with the Horus name "He who embraces the banks of the Nile." This was as much a declaration of his political aims as it was symbolic. His intention was to extend Hyksos' control beyond the delta and bring the whole of Egypt under his rule. A military campaign through Middle Egypt subdued the northern two-thirds of the country. It is even possible that the Hyksos forces captured Thebes briefly before retreating to their northern stronghold, destroying towns and temples along the way. Kian's successor, King Apipi, pushed this ambition further. He took the Horus name pacifier of the two lands, echoing the unifying rhetoric of Amenemhat I at the beginning of the 12th dynasty. On one of his monuments, he referred to himself as beloved of Seth, Lord of Sumenu. By invoking the favor of a local Theban deity, Apipi was symbolically asserting his claim to rule all of Egypt. At that moment, the future of an independent Egyptian state looked more uncertain than ever.